Hi, everyone. Uh, I'm Miranda Ragland, and I am not showing the right thing. Alrighty. Well, looks like I'm live. So, hello, everyone. Let's get this started. This is Intro to Apex for Admins and Declarative Developers. My name's Miranda Ragland. Today we will be going over a few things. First I'm going to do a basic introduction to myself, find out where you're at on your journey. We're going to talk a little bit about Apex, and then we're going to run through some examples with some best practices peppered in there. And then we'll leave about 10 minutes for questions, and then we'll go ahead and wrap this up. So, who am I? I've been developing, at least with Salesforce, for over 16 years now. I originally started programming when I was 7 years old. I was a very fortunate kid, got early access to, computer, and I wanted to know how to make it work. And then I found out that I could boss it around and totally fell in love with programming at a very early age. And so I self-taught myself originally with Pascal, and then Basic, and then I learned C. And by the time I was working with C, I was starting, like, I graduated high school, went into college, and studied computer science and got my bachelor's of science in computer science. I've learned many languages since then, but right now Apex is currently my favorite because it pays my bills, or at least it did for all the way up until last year, until I joined Bitwise, and I am now here on the leadership team and have started stepping away from code, which has been a very interesting transition for me. I've helped out with some of the certifications as a subject matter expert, volunteer, been a community group leader, spoken at a variety of conferences, including Trailhead DX and Dreamforce. Also returning to CenCal Dreamin. A couple of years ago, I was awarded a golden hoodie, which love that. I've got three wonderful kiddos, a cat who does not look like she's in the frame, but she is actually here sleeping on my desk. I love tinkering with things, and I really, really love movies. Like, huge Star Wars and Star Trek fan, just sci-fi in general. Also, really love baseball. But enough about me. Let's move into finding out where y'all are at on your journey. So I got a couple of questions for you here. And the first is just, how long have you been using Salesforce? So we'll be looking at less than a year, 1 to 3 years, or 3+ years. If you could just, let us know and give us an idea of that, that would be great. And then another question while let's see. So I'm getting used to this software. It's fun. I'll go ahead and I've just got a couple of questions for y'all, so I'll put the rest of them up here. The next will be, what role are you working in? Are you an admin? Are you currently a developer or something else? Um, uh, oops. Okay. And have you ever attempted to write code before? Just any code, like anything, other than, or just anything. But specifically, have you attempted Apex before? That's what we're looking to understand here. Also, I do have some help in here. Can we pull the admins developer poll down? Didn't quite get that one, but that's okay. It looks like we've got most people have less than a year's. Actually, it's about split, one less than 1 year to 1 to 3 years. So this is perfect. We got a couple 3+ years in here, so this is great. And yeah, we're hitting about half with the attempted to write Apex code before. So this is great. And a lot of people have attempted code before. All right, fantastic. This is for y'all. Perfect. Now, I've got one other thing. This is a personal a mission of mine, and this is something I have heard so many people say over the years, and I have a different take on it. But have you ever found yourself saying the following: "I want to be a developer, but I'm just an admin"? I have heard so many people say this to me over the years when they find out what it was that I do for a living. And they, for some reason, seem to believe that it's not something for them because they're an admin, that they see it as a different tool set. I don't see it that way. I see it very much so as the same tool set, because at the end of the day, all of us are taking requirements, we're simplifying it into smaller, chunks that are more manageable for us to work on, and then we're executing that. It's all the same tool set, it's just different tools. So my personal hope is that we can change this "I want to be a developer, but I'm just an admin" to "I want to be a developer and I want to learn new skills." Because that's what we're here to do today, to introduce you to a new skill. So how do we get started here? There's a few things that we need to ask ourselves when we're working or when we want to use Apex for a solution. And the very first is, does it even require code? Because I got to tell you, as someone who started with Apex in 2007 when it first was released, actually, let me back up a little bit. I first started working with Salesforce in 2006. Apex and Visualforce and Lightning Web Components, none of that existed. We had S controls, and those were pretty neat, but it wasn't server-side processing. It wasn't, any of that. The platform was what it was. And then in 2007, Apex was introduced, and I absolutely fell in love with it. It was very similar to what I was already using, learned everything that I could. I wanted to do everything in code because I could. And I love code. But that doesn't mean that it was necessarily the right decision, because code takes a little bit longer. There's some requirements that go along with code. We'll get into that. But, Flow didn't exist then. And it does today. And it's ridiculously powerful. There's a number of use cases that in the early days, if Flow had existed, it would have been the right tool to use. It can do a lot of different, it can process a lot of data, and you can do a lot with the tools that you have available declaratively. And so it's really, really important to ask yourself, does this even require code in the first place, or can I do this with Flow? Flow is going to be easier for a wider audience to understand and troubleshoot, for the most part. But second question that we need to ask ourselves, has someone already sold this? Is it going to be more cost effective for us to just buy a ready-made solution? Or maybe there's a Salesforce Labs app, or someone that's releasing it even for free, or maybe there's a open source solution. You may not need to do you may not need to reinvent that wheel. So it's important to look at all of your options. And another really important question to ask yourself is, have I already solved this? Is this fundamentally the same problem as something else that I've done? And we're going to get into that with our example today. Now, I told y'all I'm a movie fanatic. And for those of you who have seen me do this session before, this might be a little bit familiar. This is one of my absolute favorite things. But I always think about the movie, What About Bob? Because, Bob has a lot of challenges with accepting new things into his life. He really struggles with change. Now, it's a very, very funny movie, but the thing I took out of it the most when, I don't know, I was maybe 10 years old when I first watched this, the thing that I took away from it was baby steps get on the bus. It doesn't matter the full destination if you can't even take those first steps. So while the destination, it might be, the biggest thing in your mind, you might be hyping yourself up for it. It's really important to get yourself into that mind step where you can just take those first couple of steps and start the journey. Because sometimes that's the hardest part. It certainly has been for me with a lot of different things throughout my career. Sometimes, I personally struggle with anxiety and depression, and sometimes I'm just not feeling it. And, it takes me reminding myself, baby steps get on the bus. Just get started, get that momentum, and build from there. Now, another place where a lot of people get hung up on is, I need this tool, I need that tool, I need the whole other thing. This screenshot that I've got on the screen right now, this is a screenshot of the actual code that we're going to be developing today. And it's in an IDE. It's really, really pretty. At least I think so. A lot of people tend to agree, but this isn't important. This is just, the whole IDE experience. It's an aid, but it's not strictly necessary. Today, we're going to use the developer console, at least while we still have it, because it doesn't require the complicated setup. Now, if you want to go through and set up the IDE and work within it, there's fantastic tutorials on Trailhead, on getting Visual Studio Code and Salesforce DX all set up. But as of right now, we don't need that. We can do all of this in our browser, and that's where we're going to do it today. So again, we want to take those baby steps. We don't want to get bogged down in all of the details. And frankly, setting up the Visual Studio Code and Salesforce DX, that can be an entire session in of itself. All right. Finally, one of the most important things to know about writing Apex is, if you want to move it into production, you need to have at least 75% code coverage. It's very important, test code coverage. It's very important to write your test code so that not only do you hit that 75%, but you can algorithmically prove that your code works. It's really neat. It's actually one of my favorite things about development. We can use the same tool to prove that it itself works. Now, again, there can be an entire session, and there have been entire sessions dedicated to just unit testing strategies. We're going to take a very simple strategy today, but this is one of the most critical steps. And when working with our apprentices here at Bitwise, the very first thing that I had the crew do, and I've done this in the past at other companies, I have them start with test code, because it's a really, really great way to understand the system as a whole. And it's also a great way to practice. You get to run the code right there, see the results. Did this behave the way that I expected it to? Um, so very much so, highly recommend as your next steps to do a deep dive into unit tests. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, so let's carry on. So what exactly is Apex anyway? If you want to go with a dictionary definition, it's a strongly typed object-oriented programming language. But what the heck does that mean? Now, a lot of you do have some development experience, so you probably know what that means. But strongly typed basically just means that if you say something is an integer, you better not be writing hello world to that variable. It's not going to work. With it being strongly typed, the system's going to say, no, I'm an integer and you're trying to assign a string. We're not going to allow that. And it's going to catch it at the time that it compiles or saves up to Salesforce. And object-oriented programming languages, again, this could be not just an entire presentation, but an entire series. We're not going to do a deep dive into inheritance and encapsulation and everything that makes up object-oriented programming languages. Right now, it's important to know that is what the term is. But again, this is something, it could be an entire session and series of sessions in of itself. Apex is itself very, very similar to Java and C#. In fact, those were the two languages that I was working in professionally before I started my Salesforce journey. I was doing enterprise Java for the company that got me started in Salesforce. And before that, I was writing a laboratory management system in C# using the .NET framework. The syntax of the language, it's very similar to those two if you know either of them. It's also very similar to C. But if you already know those, it's going to feel a little bit familiar. One of the more important things to know about Apex is that it actually runs on the Salesforce servers. Unlike Aura or Lightning Web Components, where Visual Force that renders a page, it's not executing in your browser. This actually happens on the Salesforce servers, and there's a variety of different mechanisms that can invoke the code. And it might be anonymous Apex, or it might be a trigger responding to an event in the system, or maybe you've captured a platform event, or you can schedule Apex to run at a certain time every day, or once a week, once a month, once a year, or on any schedule that you want. And one of the really neat things about Apex is because it runs on the Salesforce server side, you can use some of the features of the framework itself to parse through ungodly amounts of data using the batchable interface, for example. And I already hinted on it a little bit. There's also a fairly robust testing framework that has been extended throughout the years. It's only gotten better and better and better as they've continued to develop the Salesforce platform. Unit testing used to be a whole lot harder in the early days, but now we've got the mock interfaces and everything else, and it makes it a lot easier to simulate some behaviors that happen in the system. And again, this is a few steps down the road. Right now, we're just trying to focus on an introduction, but there's just so much that you can do with this technology. So our example that we're going to be working with today is a very simple example. If you have an address that has some special characters in it, and you want to be able to enable an admin to create a link where someone can just go through and click on the, like a view custom map and have it pop up a map. If you've got certain special characters, specifically the ampersand and the hash symbol, those are special characters in a URL. You might end up, if you don't encode your address, you might end up getting unpredictable results. Now, there are ways that you can achieve this without code, but this was literally one of the first things that I ever did in my own personal Apex journey. And it just feels like it's a great example. This is what got me started, and it's fairly easy to understand. We're not going to be writing a whole lot of code today. This is really just to get your feet wet and inspire some ideas and hopefully break down that barrier where you feel empowered to where you can go through and take those next steps. So let's go ahead and get into this. We're going to start with a very, very simple address encoding. And for that, I need to pop over here into our Salesforce org. And we'll come in here and go to the developer console. I'm going to pop it open in a new tab so that it is visible to everyone here. And let me go ahead and make that a little bit bigger. Let me know in the chat if you're having any trouble seeing it. It looks like this is a pretty good size here. So actually, let me pop back over here into the setup interface real quick. And because we're going to do address encoding, I have made a very, very simple text field to just contain the encoded street value from the address field. So what's going to happen here is when someone puts in an address into the system, it will run our Apex code and generate the value that goes here in this encoded street. We're going to do this with an Apex trigger. This is very, very simple way to start on your Apex journey. So we'll come in here, and I'm using the developer console today. The Cloud IDE isn't quite ready yet. At least I haven't been able to get my hands on it. I'm also seeing I may have actually accidentally linked the older version of this. I'm sorry. I will send an updated link for this slide. It's saying I'm still with M7 Unlimited. Sorry. We'll be using the developer console today because we still have access to it, and it's quite easy to work with here. So I'm going to come in, and we're just going to create a new trigger on the lead object, and we'll just simply call it lead trigger. Really? Okay. There we go. All right. And our lead trigger is going to be quite simple. Trigger has a few different items in it. First of all, there is a syntax for this, and A more in-depth explanation can be found on Trailhead. But there's a few things going on here. We're telling the system that this is a trigger. That's the name of our trigger, what object it is on, and what events we are responding to. Specifically here, we're looking for inserts and updates, and we want this code to run before it saves to the database in both cases. We want that because we're going to be making a slight change to the object right before it changes. And because triggers can operate on up to 200 records at a time, we need to do this in a loop structure. So we're saying for each lead that is contained within this trigger, we're going to run this bit of code. And the very, very first thing that we're doing here is blanking out the value that we're writing to. And we're going to do that because if someone removes the street address, we want to make sure that the encoded address gets cleared out as well. The next step that we're going to go through is we're going to make sure that we actually do indeed have a street address, because we don't want to run any code if we don't have to. And finally, where we do the actual work, we're going to take advantage of the encoding util class, which has a method called URL encode. And what that does is it takes the street address and it makes it safe for encoding within a URL. So things like the ampersand or that hash mark will get escaped out into a very specific format that browsers and web servers and everything else can understand and parse programmatically and turn back into those characters when it's reading them. And that's it. This is our very, very simple trigger. If I save this, I can come back in here and let's open up the sales app and pop right on over to our friend, the leads. And I am now hoping I have my list views set up properly. But if I come in here and pop my information in here, and let's give it, it does look like I've got the wrong, no, let's, what was it was hot and cold lane. Number 55. So if I come through here and, yeah, I unfortunately, yeah, no, I've unfortunately got the wrong page view set up, but we didn't air out, and then because we didn't air out, I know it worked. Let's just real quick, I'll show it to you right here. Select ID street and encoded. We've only got one record in here, so I'm just gonna limit it out to one rather than pull. Oh, the fun of doing this live. Let me make sure I assign my permission set, which I don't think I did. I did not. That would explain that. Okay, let's do that again. There we go. Now you see here, this is basically the same value. It's just got this special encoding in here that makes it easier for a URL to understand. It's, again, very, very simple code. We're only doing the one thing other than a little bit of setup. And let me know if y'all have any questions here, but I'm going to go ahead and move on. And I will make this code available to everyone after the fact. So best practice when we're using code is to only use code when it's necessary. You'll notice that I only encoded the street address right there. I kept it as small and tight as possible. I could, in past versions of this, I've done the full street address, generated the map link and everything else like that. That's actually something that you can do with declarative features. So I only created the small bit that needs to be done in code and did only that in code. The rest of it, we can build all of that out in the declarative interface. You know, in fact, actually just using a formula field. So in that case, I didn't need to use code for the rest of it because there is a declarative solution. And there also could be app exchange solutions. But one of the reasons why we want to do this in code is actually to lead us to our next examples, because we want to do this with multiple objects. And because leads aren't the only object that have addresses associated with them. Accounts have addresses, contacts have addresses. You can have a custom object that might need to do the same address encoding. We've got a situation here where if we want to go through and extend this to accounts and contacts, we could absolutely copy the code that we have, be off and running, and it'll work, no problem. But we also can take into account the fact that if we don't need to repeat ourselves, we can create what's called a helper class and set it up so that if our standards for encoding these addresses ever change, like maybe we're working with a legacy system that needs everything in uppercase, we would have to go through and update all of those different points in the code where we copied and pasted it instead of, but when we use the helper class, we then only have one spot where we need to update it. It's a trade-off for sure. But there we go. And also I am seeing that I need to speed this up. So here we go. Our second example would be extending this to a second set of objects. And I am going to go ahead and just push the code, and I will show you how we extended this for source. Okay, here we go. Oh, come on. All right. Here we go. Let's go ahead and we will reopen our lead example here, and we'll open up a couple of other items. The address helper, and if we refresh here, we now have multiple triggers. So we've now changed I've created the helper class, and this is essentially the same as the code that you saw before. It takes in the street address, sets an encoded value to null to initialize it, and then we do the encoding and return it. The only thing that's really changed is we've added this layer on top of it. And why we did that was so that we can now apply it to multiple street addresses here on the account record on the account object. And we've also done the exact same thing on the contact object. All this does is run that exact same code. But we've now changed it so that we've got the helper class. So if we ever need to go through and do something like to uppercase, if I could stop typing that underscore, that would be great. There we go. We've now updated all 5 of those address encodings, and we can turn around and use this with a custom object or a custom field added to any other object. This gives us the ability to reuse it. So yeah, that's all right. Sorry, there is a little bit of noise outside. I hope it's not picking up, but it is slightly distracting. All right. And a good rule of thumb for working with triggers is to only have one trigger per S object. When I first started with Apex, I fell into this trap, and it became really, really hard to manage. Usually, I'm showing you examples right now where there is code directly in the trigger. Once you move beyond these first steps into Apex, it's actually really common to use a trigger handling framework so that you actually end up putting the logic in either a helper class or a trigger handler class, and that itself turns around and makes it so that you can have these very simple one line or just a handful of line triggers. And it also helps with just general testability going forward. So I'm going to show you one more example of code, and that's going to be the unit test code. And I got to push this up real quick. Now we'll be getting into this. Really is one of my favorite things. There's a special type of Apex class that can create called a test class, and it allows us to use code to actually prove that our code works. So in this simple example right here, we are calling this method with a sample and making sure that, yes, this does produce a different result than what we put into it. And it can work with adding data to the system. Now, it looks like I'm adding an account, but actually what happens in the testing context, this never actually gets saved in your Salesforce org. It instead cleans it up after the fact. So I can go through and add whatever data I want very simply and programmatically to set up my test. And then we can do a simple query to pull it back out and test, did this actually change? There's so much more here. I'm sorry, I did not pace this out properly, but I highly recommend working with unit tests as your first step. There's a lot of the programming logic that you'll end up seeing within the unit tests. You'll get introduced to queries, and it will just help you think about how code functions on the system as a whole. Finally, our final best practice is to use the declarative features anytime that you can. You really do want to minimize the amount of code that runs on the system. It's a little bit harder to debug Apex code, and there's just a ton of different things that you can use. Like, for example, in the code example, I had the character encoding hard coded as a string, and that was UTF-8. But if we ever wanted to migrate to UTF-16 or some other character set, I would have to update every single one of those. Whereas if I had put it in custom metadata or even maybe a custom label, I'd be able to change it in the interface and the code would automatically update itself. So use your declarative features to your best advantage wherever you can. There's a variety of different resources available on Trailhead that can really get you started, help you point you towards those next steps. So I highly recommend that you check those out. And please let me know if you have any questions. Let's see, do we have anything in here? All right. No, I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A. And yeah, I will go ahead. I will get our friends here at CenCal Dreamin the correct slide deck. I accidentally sent the old one, as well as a link to the code. All of this is actually up on GitHub, so I can provide that to y'all as well. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and drop this right now into the chat. And well, yeah, thanks so much. I've been Miranda Ragland, VP of Salesforce Delivery here at Bitwise Industry, and it's been my pleasure to share all of this with y'all. Hope you have a great day.